Hello everyone, this is my Morality Behind Capital Punishment Persuasive essay. So, here we go. Various forms of punishment have been in place for crimes committed in our country, but capital punishment has been one of the forms that have caused the most outrage throughout the years. Much of the controversy behind the capital punishment is due to moral, ethical, and political issues. The crafters of the U.S. Constitution even warned against such types of punishment in the Constitution that are considered cruel. The Eighth Amendment says, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. The last part of this amendment applies to capital punishment because of the controversial method that it puts to get those on death row to death. Over time, the ambiguity of the meaning of the Eighth Amendment has caused a divide between the states, with it a divide in our civilization as a whole. The largest part of concern in the topic is the morality of the subject, and it strikes a sensitive nerve for a lot of people to try and consider their side on the matter. They'll have to bear the mental weight of their part in putting a man to death, and can these individuals live with it? Some ask, what exactly is the use with the death penalty? And those who commit the crimes horrendous enough deserve a fitting punishment, right? While the debate of whether or not the death penalty should be widely accepted rages on, most of those with opinions consider the crime committed in response to the criminal's fate. What isn't commonly considered is the proof of innocence, or one being framed for a crime that you can't prove or they didn't commit. Well-educated anti-death penalty advocates may claim a speedy trial with an immediate following of execution and can wrongly end an innocent person's life. There have been rare accounts of over 150 people taken off of death row after being proven innocent in recent years. Proof of false imprisonment cases, months, years, decades, and even a century after the victim had been wrongly imprisoned have been recorded in United States federal penitentiaries. During the 90s, 80% of Americans favored the death penalty, yet since then it has slowly decreased. This pattern was broke after the September 11 attacks on the World Trade Center, with the favor of the death penalty rising from 55% to 67% from 2001 to 2002, respectively. With the pattern emerging the following year in 2003 and continuing to the most recent poll taken in 2016, where it was recorded that 49% of Americans favored the death penalty and 46% did not. 5% of that was undecided. Pro-death penalty advocates uphold the ideal that only the most heinous crimes deserve only the most ultimate penalty. That removing this punishment would ease the ideals of repercussions to criminal spheres and fears of being caught. And if no one knows they'll be put to death for a horrendous crime, it is certainly more effective at changing their reasoning compared to being imprisoned for a life sentence or longer. Another reasoning is that the price of putting someone to death is less costly than that of making the offender serve a life sentence in prison, and because they'll be housed and guarded and given food and health care and clothing and toiletries and all that other things that from commissary that are expensive. Therefore, arguably putting them to death is much more effective. Some anti-death penalty backers claim our justice system is fundamentally flawed, with a racial factor being the determinant of whether or not a criminal gets a life sentence. They may claim the death penalty's racial legacy tends to favor minorities above all other ethnicities, but as a death penalty census dating back to 1977 reads, 48.6% of those who were served a death sentence were Caucasian, and 40.9% were African American, and the other 9% were made up from the remaining convicted. Anti-death protesters also make the objection that in many ways the form of execution is still very inhumane. An example of this was the failed lethal injection of Clayton Darrell Lockett at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. After being convicted of forcible oral sodomy, robbery, assault, rape, first-degree murder, kidnapping, and burglary, he was sentenced to death. Lockett was injected with a lethal composition of sodium thiopental. He survived and experienced extreme irritation of his skin. And after another 45 minutes of excruciating pain, as reported by one of his supervising executioners, Mr. Lockett was injected with morphine and within 15 minutes died of a heart attack. Most people would consider this very inhumane and extremely unacceptable. Now here's the shocking part. This isn't the first time an execution was botched like this. There are 276 other cases of failed executions in the United States in the past 120 years. That's 3.15% of all executions in the United States. Many of the other forms of execution are also even more inhumane than lethal injections if botched. There have been 85 failed hangings, 84 failed electrocutions, 75 failed injections, and 32 failed lethal gas chamber attempts. That can compare to the Nazis back in World War I and World War II. In correlation with this ongoing debate on capital punishment, the U.S. has seen an overall decline in the number of deaths per year. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, there are currently 2,673 prisoners on death row as of April 1st, 2019, from the Death Row Overview. The time of prisoners spent on death row has no specific time frame. As a matter of fact, prisoners on death row typically spend more than a decade waiting for execution. Some prisoners have been on death row for well over 20 years now, the time on death, and many prisoners on death row have now been pardoned of their death sentence at the end of the wait, or have been non-capitally resentenced to time on death. The number of executions in the U.S. due to the death penalty, however, has dropped from 85 executions in 2000 to 46 executions in 2010, and 17 executions so far in 2019. This is coming from the Executions Overview, same article. This data comes from a decrease in death penalty executions over the past 2 decades, and Texas was the first state responsible for most of the executions, with 566 executions since the late 1900s until up to this year. From the 1620 BC Draconian Code of Athens, which ruled the death penalty a suitable deterrent to every crime as mild as the theft of a single apple, to the current Florida statutes that describe execution as a punishment only for capital drug trafficking and cases of murder with especially aggravating factors. The usage of the death penalty has been dwindled over the course of history, and the methods by which those sentenced have also evolved to become more humane and solemn. While not as gruesome, for example, the crucifixions and impalements practiced in ancient Rome, methods of carrying out the death penalty around the world during the time of the conception of the United States, including hanging, beheading, burning, and pressing, are now commonly considered to be immoral in comparison to the modern American standard of lethal injection. This gradual societal striving for the most painless form of execution has had some hiccups, though. Due to its humaneness, death by injection is currently the default in every state that employs capital punishment, but many grant inmates on death row an alternative method upon request. During an interview with Alive Toy, she speculated perhaps most importantly in its supreme gravity is the death penalty. Promotes belief in respect for the majesty of the moral order and for the system of humane law that derives both from and supports that moral order. This backs a no-fault argument for the pro-death penalty advocates and takes on the ideal that if someone did not truly deserve death, then they must receive it to keep the justice system in control. Yet in another interview with the opposing side of the argument, Seaman Thompson, a former superintendent at the Oregon State Penitentiary, says, "I was charged with executing 2 inmates on the penitentiary death row, Douglas Franklin Wright and Harry Charles Moore. Regardless of the crimes, the fact that I was now to be personally involved in their executions forced me into a deeper reckoning with my feelings about capital punishment. After much contemplation, I became convinced that on a moral level, life was either hollowed or it wasn't, and this shows that the capital punishment couldn't rip out our morality in connection to our humanity." In all, the components that make up for the death penalty, such as its history, evolution, methods of execution, arguments, false accusations, and differing views of morality, feed the growing debate in America over this subject, and whether we should abolish the death penalty or not, the information above is starting to prove that capital punishment does not deter crime, and the abolition of capital punishment would be another historic event in American history. It would be a new chapter in the justice system of the United States, with reform punishments and more conscience of the public of the conviction process, and I believe that in order for our country to grow and prosper as a moral society, the death penalty should be abolished.